It's just one song I prepared, Satish, actually, but it's one very special song. A song written especially for this occasion. Satish asked me if I would do so, and as a songwriter, that's like the best thing you could be asked to do, is write something for a really specific moment. And the muses were on my side, because when I wrote this song, it kind of came to me all at once, as if it kind of already existed. And I did kind of check that it wasn't already a song. But no, it turns out, especially for today, and it's called Wisdom of the Trees.
Thank you, Anna. That was absolutely beautiful, and so lovely to hear your wonderful sound. And thank you, all of you, for coming this evening, in this wet and rainy evening. I don't know if it's still raining, but the whole day has been very wet. It is a great pleasure to have Ben Goldsmith this evening with us at Dartington. I think your first visit, isn't it?
It's my first visit here. I feel like I've been here. I've been reading stuff from Schumacher for 20 years. I actually saw recently an article which said that in 1978, at the first planning meeting to set up this college, my Uncle Teddy was there.
Yes.
And the group nominated none other than Satish to chair the enterprise. And my Uncle Teddy was very, very good to my brother and me after my father died, and was a huge inspiration for us.
Yes. So
welcome. So it's kind of great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And Teddy Goldsmith, Ben just mentioned, was the founder of the Ecologist magazine, And now Resurgence and Ecologist have merged together, so we are in a way kind of partners in our work as well. And so it's a great pleasure, and it's a special occasion is this book, advanced copies, because Ben has written this book, God is an Octopus. It's a lovely title, I love the title. And the book is to be published on the 11th of May, but we are all very fortunate to have advanced copies here. And so I would like to start with asking a few questions to Ben, and then we will have a bit of dialogue. This book is very much about nature, and also inspired by, which Ben will maybe mention, his daughter's accidental death when she was only 15 years old, and how Ben found some kind of solace in that very sad and very miserable time, that losing your daughter, so young, so beautiful, so promising life, future, losing, that's a big tragic situation, but somehow there's a healing process. The last chapter is the healing, and so it's a wonderful book. I read it and I enjoyed it. Ben writes it very well. It's beautifully written, and it's a very moving story, sad but also inspiring. It's both a combination. And so I would like to start, Ben, by asking you, you have written about so much love for nature in your book, and you celebrate nature in such a wonderful, enthusiastic way. But at this moment in Britain, nature is very much managed and very much kind of manipulated. And nature is a kind of like we use nature for just human purpose. And so depleted. It's very organized, commercialized, factory farming, and most of the forests have gone. So how do you still feel that love for nature in this kind of depleted nature situation in our country and in the world generally?
I mean, I think that all children are born with a fascination for nature. You find a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, show them a frog or a bird's nest with blue eggs in it, they're obsessed immediately. The writer E.O. Wilson coined the term biophilia to describe the innate love for nature that we all have. And he describes this as being innate from birth. But as we grow older, in most people, it falls somewhat dormant. It never goes away, but it certainly becomes dormant. And the notion that it doesn't go away is inherent in, for example, a flat overlooking the park will sell for twice the price of one that doesn't. People on some level still crave contact with nature. I was an obsessional child, so I was really obsessed with nature growing up. Digging ponds, which never worked out. I was in Sandy, where I grew up in Richmond in West London, putting up bird boxes, getting up at the crack of dawn, looking for kind of foxes and badgers and all kinds of stuff. And that really was what I lived and breathed in my free time in every waking moment. I was surrounded by a handful of adults who similarly loved nature, who kind of made it okay that obsession be taken into adulthood. I remember age 14 writing a letter to Country Life magazine saying I thought their readership lacked imagination on the subject of wild boar. And I won a prize. I think I got a coat or a pair of binoculars or something, and I certainly didn't tell my teenage friends about that letter. So I was fascinated into adulthood by nature. And if you have that obsession, you can't help but begin to realise how little of it we have left in this country. And I think a lot of people don't realise what we've lost. Now, I grew up in a place that did have quite a lot of nature. In fact, nature in the suburbs is better often than in the countryside. We had an aunt out in Dorset, and periodically we would be loaded into a car and driven what seemed to me like an entire day out to Dorset. And there was a kind of series of fields with quite tightly cropped hedges, and we might see the odd crow. I mean, maybe I wasn't looking hard enough, but I really used to find those trips very disappointing. There was way more nature in the edge of Richmond Park than we found out in Dorset. And I think that that's perhaps what's changing now, is that people are starting to realise how little we've got left. And we had lunch with George Monbiot today here, and his book Feral was really, really influential in my life, because it shows you that it opens your eyes to things that you can't then unsee. I mean, the Highlands of Scotland, for example, or Central Wales. Even I used to imagine that it was sort of supposed to be like that. And when you realise that the treelessness and this kind of miles upon miles of millennia grass and nothing much else isn't natural, it's the product of a terrible depletion that happened before we were born, you can't unsee that. And I think that people come to visit England and they fly into Gatwick Airport and they see wherever, and they see kind of that beautiful kind of patchwork quilt of small fields with very green and neat little lines and hedgerows, and they think that's nature, and they don't realise that it's more or less completely silent and it's desperately depleted.
Like a green desert.
Like a green concrete. People have described the dairy farms of Devon as green concrete. So I think therein lies an enormous opportunity. As people start to realise this, there is this growing clamour for restoration. I think that the lockdowns and all of that went on in 2020, 2021 forced people to stay at home, and the only activity was to explore the nature in their immediate vicinity. I think it found people seeking out patches of wildflowers. I don't know if people remember, but that spring, that first lockdown was really magical. And so people were forced to explore their neighbourhood and look for nature, and I think they realised how important nature is, not just to our kind of physical health and even to our mental well-being, but to our spiritual selves. Contact with nature is something that we need on a visceral level in ways that we don't fully yet understand, or ways in which we can't quite articulate. And so I think that we're going through a sort of watershed moment. There's kind of an upwelling of love for nature in this country, and beyond, everywhere, but particularly here that we see. The stalks at Knepp is a great example. Then people saw the reintroduction of white stalks by Knepp and two other estates in Sussex. And the last time white...
People don't know about Knepp.
Yeah, we'll come to Knepp.
Yeah.
But on stalks, the last time stalks were supposedly bred in Britain was on Edinburgh Cathedral in the sort of 1480s or 1490s.
Yeah.
And they're iconic, they kind of symbol of fertility, and they matter. And they've disappeared. And they were reintroduced, and now they're wheeling above the skies of southern England. Well, that story was among the most kind of clicked story on the BBC during 2020, 2021. People were mad for it. Knepp is sold out, the Knepp Rewilding project in Sussex, where the stalks can be seen, sold out for kind of 2 years in advance. If there's ever an opportunity to do something big, it's now, is my view.
I mean, when David Attenborough makes films, he generally goes away somewhere in Africa or Australia or New Zealand or some faraway places to make films about nature. But because nature in Britain is more or less depleted, although now he's starting to look at nature in England, and also he's finding quite disappointing.
So Knepp, I thought most people here know the story of Knepp, but Knepp is, it's like you're in Tanzania or somewhere, or what was the example you used, Rajasthan.
Rajasthan.
Satish said it felt like Rajasthan after the rains, the kind of dotted scrub and wildflowers and kind of little islands of trees and great flocks of birds. And birdsong, if you're there between kind of March and June, birdsong that is like nothing you've heard anywhere in this country. It's like a wall of sound. I mean, it's overwhelming. It kind of goes through you. It's so powerful. In fact, Knepp, having been an industrial farm 20 years ago, now has a greater density of breeding songbirds of any site in Britain. There's nothing like it. It's the only place in Britain where nightingales, turtle doves, all these declining species are on the up. And the magic formula is derived from the work of a guy called Professor Franz Vero. And he's an icon, really. And he's, I think, with the University of Utrecht. He once retweeted me, and I'm so excited I can barely breathe. Franz Vero was the professor who suggested that perhaps Western Europe and Britain were not made up of closed canopy forest. We weren't like Brazil. He pointed out that most of the species that we revere, the berries that we pick, the songbirds that sing, the hedgehogs, the edible mushrooms, the trees, the crabapples, even the English oak, they all thrive in sunlight. They require sunlight. So what that points to is a past in which sunlight was much more abundant than is the case in a woodland. Today we sort of fetishize woodland. We have our fields and neat lines, and then we have our blocks of woodland. And that is considered the pinnacle of nature in Britain is woodland. But actually, once the canopy closes, you lose a whole bunch of species. And he points out that the ecological historians had ignored the role of large animals, and keystones in particular. And the principal engineer of those mosaic, kind of shape-shifting, mosaic woodlands that he describes in his original piece of work are the bovines, or the cattle. And he points out that historically, long before there were humans, there were millions of wild bison, and there were wild ox. The last wild ox in Britain were shipped to the Colosseum to be slaughtered in front of the crowds there. And the last wild ox in Europe were killed by soldiers in Poland in the 1650s or 60s. So that's a species which is now extinct, but whose DNA lives on in the more traditional varieties of cattle, the Italian Maramana cattle, the fighting bulls of Spain, the longhorns that we have here. And there's an amazing project in the Netherlands called the Taros Project, which has got big funding. And they're not doing gene editing or genetic modification, they're doing simple selective backbreeding to try and recreate this species out of DNA which already exists. And they're almost there. They're there to the extent that they're now putting wild taros, they call them. The original species were called aurochs. They're now putting them out in the wild. The shipment of 12 just got released in the Greater Coa Valley in Portugal, and they will live as wild cattle. So Western Europe and Britain had these in abundance, and they were grazing and browsing and trampling and creating all kinds of disturbance and effectively waging war against woody vegetation. And Franz Vera suggests that if you have a perfectly pitched battle between those grazing animals and the woody vegetation, the upshot is a kind of rocket fuel scenario for wildlife of all kinds. And NEP has proven the model. And Franz Vera goes on to describe the 3 other keystones. He suggests that there are 4 keystones in the British environment, all 4 of which, incidentally, were removed at the same time from our last truly wild landscape, which was the Caledonian forest. The great Caledonian mosaic forest, which stretched kind of most of the length and breadth of Scotland, even until quite recently, pretty much disappeared in one go. And it was a lot to do with the trees being cut to make navy ships. But then what happened was the people were removed, the highland clearances, to make way for sheep. So the people, the indigenous highlanders, who were nominally Christian, but they had a shamanistic religion which was deeply entwined with their own natural environment, they were shipped off to the coast, so potato famines and all kinds of suffering in the western coast of Scotland, and many of them then went on ships, often their tickets paid for by the same landlords who kicked them off. And they went to Canada, they went to West Indies, and with them, their cattle left the land and were replaced by sheep. And that's why we have this desperately depleted, heavily overgrazed landscape now in most of the British uplands. And we'll talk about sheep, I hope, in a minute. But the other keystones alongside the cattle, according to Franz Vera, are the pig, number 2, or the wild boar, nature's gardener, turns the soil, and there's amazing videos on YouTube you can see of a family of wild boar viewed from a drone, and they're kind of rootling like kind of fingers in the landscape in the winter, with a family of boar. And then the same spot, kind of 6 months later, and it's strips of colour painted into the landscape. Because most of the ephemeral wild flowers, the poppies, the cornflowers, the scarlet pimpernel, they all require open, bare earth to germinate. That's why they've disappeared, because we don't have wild boar and we don't run free-range pigs in the way that we used to. And similarly, the black poplar and the European aspen are 2 of Britain's rarest tree species, and that's because their seeds can only germinate on the bare earth created by pigs. So nature's gardener was killed off at about the same time as the clearances. Number 3, the beaver. And the beaver, of course, is the keystone of all keystone, absent for about 500 years, absent from most of Europe for longer than that. Probably 200 to 300 million beavers, reduced to 1,000 or 2,000 by 1900, but making a steady recovery across much of its range and now back across northern Europe, and they're back in Britain, mostly because of beaver bombers. And beaver bombing is the reason why there are beavers in Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Britain. The governments are generally useless at getting around to doing these things, especially our government. Beavers bring water, and as Satish said at the beginning, water is life. If you think of a typical English valley system, in the absence of beavers, it rains, the water runs down the stream, a couple of days later it's gone. Introduce beavers into the system and they create what strikes me as a kind of string of Japanese rice terraces, like a string of dams behind each of which is created a pool, and the pool of water sits there all year round and becomes a haven for amphibians. The Devon Beaver Project around the corner recorded a 16,000% increase in breeding amphibians in one site in the space of 4 years. With kingfishers, ducks, dragonflies, and all the little tiny zooplankton and phytoplankton in the water, which are the base of the food chain for everything. But they also, beavers, create these nature corridors that run through otherwise farmed landscapes. Places like Bavaria, animals like pine martens and deer and boar and little creatures can now move through the landscape just using these ribbon wetlands as their passageways across the landscape. Beavers disappeared from Britain a little bit earlier than the Highland clearances, and we don't fully understand the terrible consequences of that absence. And then the fourth being the wolf. I don't know how soon we'll see wolves in Devon, but they're just across the water in Normandy. I'm in suburban Normandy. I have a friend who does dressage, I was saying this earlier, who has horses, and it's very suburban, the whole thing. And he calls me from his phone, listen, listen, listen. Holds his phone up and you can hear the sound of wolves howling in the woodland nearby his house. And they're in the urban precincts now of Luxembourg, Amsterdam, Paris, they're in Madrid. There are wolves trotting through the sort of suburban streets of Berlin. And the idea that we can't live alongside wolves and figure that out is really an absurdity, and it's an immoral argument. I can't see it happening anytime soon, so it'll have to be, in my farm, Derek, a man with a huge moustache and a gun, who comes and plays the role of wolf and controls deer numbers. But it's the wolf that keeps these animals in check and keeps them from congregating in sensitive parts of the landscape, for example, alongside the rivers. It changes their behavior. So this Vera theory is just transformational in the conversation around how to restore nature. It's just for someone like me who's been obsessed all my life with nature and has really had to settle for some pretty impoverished nature experiences, the work of Vera is just too exciting for words, especially now that it's happening everywhere. There's 250,000 acres pursuing this idea of re-establishing natural processes and allowing self-willed nature to recover. And that's just in England. It's at least twice that number in Scotland. So I think we live in those of us who really love nature, I think we live in a very, very exciting time. I think we have the possibility to put things back better than they've been for centuries. I don't think we need to go on British Airways to Nairobi, which I once did and nearly died because a hijacker tried. It's a different story. It's a true story though. We don't need to fly halfway across the world to experience rich nature. I think it'll be on our doorstep. It already is to some degree.
But this seems like a very kind of idealistic and hopeful dream you have, that we are living in a very good time to restore nature. But if you look at the industry, business, government, most of the trend, I mean, there is a love for nature emerging or re-emerging, but the practicalities are still very much in favor of industrial farming, industrial forestry, and all that. So what gives you this hope that we are at a turning point?
So, for starters, I fully recognise the gravity of the situation we're in.
Yeah.
I like everyone in this room, feel, most likely everyone in this room, that we, this generation, gets to see the end game. You know, either we will continue to wreck it, and we will witness the end of civilization and worse, or we will move into the sunlit uplands of a harmonious existence with nature. And I think there's flickerings of kind of optimism and hope that that will be the case. And I'm certainly an optimist, and I think the way to live our lives is to take joy from participating in that movement. The rewilding of a piece of land, the advocacy for a change in the rules, the work around education and behaviour change, whatever it is, being part of that movement is a very good place in which to live your life. And even if we don't succeed, we'll at least have lived the way we're meant to live. I think that there are two magic ingredients that are needed for that to happen, for the right outcome to happen. The first is a spiritual reconnection with nature, and I think that's starting to happen. I think the newspapers today are unrecognisable as compared with where they were 10 years ago. So I think that's a topic perhaps we can revisit in a bit, but I think how do we achieve that, and how do we make it, a sort of a spiritual yearning to be close to nature and to restore nature, as it is among all indigenous societies. 80% of the world's remaining intact ecosystems are in the stewardship of indigenous people. Now, that's not a coincidence. It's because their very being, on every level, is intrinsically and completely connected with the natural world around them. And they look with horror. But the other ingredient is economic. And why do I feel optimistic that business will change and farming will change? Yeah. And that's because in the system in which we operate, you have to have economic recognition of the value of nature. Otherwise, it simply doesn't get valued and gets trashed. So take a mangrove in a tropical country. The one way to look at it is wasteland, cut the mangrove, burn the timber, and establish a shrimp farm. And for a few years, you'll make hard cash from that shrimp farm until the thing falls apart and becomes too salinated and so on. Or you look at the economic value of that mangrove. We know how much carbon they sequester, acre for acre. There is a price on carbon now in the voluntary carbon market. You look at the price of flood defence. Where there are mangroves, you're protected from storm surges and tsunamis, and there is a value to that flood defence because we know what it costs to build concrete alternatives. Think of tropical fisheries. About 90% of the fish species which are the staple for billions of people are raised, grow up in the nursery ground of the mangroves. Start to stack those things up, and you suddenly come to an economic value of mangroves. And when that economic value becomes recognised in decision making, then the mangrove is more likely to survive than not. And I think we need that economic case as well. I love George Monbiot with all my heart, and I completely buy his argument that these things are intrinsically priceless. You know, how do you price the love you feel for your parents? You know, you can't put a price on that. But if we don't when it comes to nature, then it will simply be the case that, especially in countries that are short of money and that need to get ahead, the wrong decisions will be taken. So in this country, we spend a certain amount of money on flood defence, but we know that the towns that flood are often the towns that are surrounded by sheep-wrecked, compacted, bare hills. You know, Buckfastleigh in Devon here in Dartmoor. Well, Dartmoor is a completely bare, utterly compacted landscape by millions of heavily subsidised sheep, and taxpayers are paying twice, not just in the subsidies, but they're paying to help the poor residents of Buckfastleigh rebuild their homes every 2 or 3 years. So if you can start to write nature restoration into the solution as a way of reducing flooding and drought, as many councils are now doing, then suddenly there's an economic value to having more trees on your land, or more nature, more wetlands and so on. So in my little farm cluster in Somerset, the Somerset County Council has just spent about 180,000 creating new wetlands. I'm lucky enough to have one on my farm. They selected it, they designed it, and when it rains, the wetland fills with water. It's like giant beavers came and created giant rice paddies, and it's full of reeds and little pockets of willow growing up, and it's full of amazing birds, and all paid for by the council because they want to reduce flooding in Frome. So I think once you start to value the tangible output from healthy nature, then you change the equation when it comes to deciding what to do with land. And that's really happening in this country, faster than in almost any other country. Now, Costa Rica went from 23% forest cover in 1990 or 1985 to almost 60% forest cover today. And all they did was work out how much money people were earning from the lowest grade farmland, the slopes and all the kind of places where you had 1 cow per hectare. And they worked out that it was about $64. So they said, we'll pay $80 per hectare for at least 20 years if you allow forests to regrow on your land. So anyone with productive farmland producing pineapples or whatever didn't even look at it because they were making far more money. But the great swathes of the country that were covered with cattle ranches very quickly were reforested. And incidentally, when Costa Rica ran out of money for paying for that, they then went to the government of the Netherlands and said, listen, will you cancel the debt that we have outstanding? And we promise to use the interest payments that we were paying to you in order to perpetuate this system that we've developed. And it's been a triumph. Well, England is doing something similar. We have an environmental land management scheme. No one on the left or the right or in the farming industry or in the environment movement has understood how big a change this environmental land management scheme is. Because subsidies for farming, which amounted originally to 80-odd pounds per acre, no matter what you did with it, as long as there was no nature, or let nature come back and the eye in the sky would spot it. And that bit of land would be carved out of the equation. So you have to clear your scrub, you have to drain your ditches, you have to drain your wetlands, you have to plough it and so on. Now, those payments over 7 years are going to zero, but the same amount of money is available if you can show you're delivering stewardship and restoration of soil and nature. And so those payments are rising. And that is just a transformational moment, and the first big bust-up over the whole thing is happening here on Dartmoor right now, and that's a discussion over sheep. Should we talk about Dartmoor?
Yes.
Yes! Dartmoor. I got in so much trouble.
I like Wistman's Wood.
Yeah, Wistman's Wood, of course, was fenced off, and Dartmoor should be a combination of twinkling, mysterious, extraordinary rainforests, of which we've lost 99% in
Most of it had gone.
Most of it's gone, about 1% left, if that, in tiny pockets like Wistman's that were fenced off. And meanwhile, of course, we wag our finger at the UN and bollock all these countries with far lower GDP per capita, far more people, far less food security, and we bollock them about their rainforest. And we don't really have a leg to stand on when it comes to rainforest. But it should also be wood pastures and peatland. The middle of Dartmoor should be that extraordinarily soft, spongy sphagnum stuff with interesting wading birds and interesting little amphibians and so on. And then you should have wood pastures and savannas of the
Dart used to mean oak. And
Dart is oak.
Dartmoor should be full of oaks, like Westman's Wood.
Like Westman's Wood. It's all gone. It's all gone. 10 years ago it was in a bad state already. Since then, Natural England, out of its limited budget, Natural England is a tiny, tiny organisation in the context of the machinery of government. You consider the MOD, Ministry of Defence, or the NHS. I reckon the MOD and the NHS spend more money on stationery than the total budget of Natural England. Tiny amount of money. There'll be more now that we have an environmental land management scheme. But looking backwards, Natural England spent £200 million of taxpayers' hard-earned money to subsidise nature recovery by farmers on Dartmoor. That's in 10 years, from 2012 to 2022. In those 10 years, every single indicator has declined even worse. There is no nature recovery at all to show for that 200 million. By any standard, it's a squandering of public money. So Natural England have said, okay, folks, under the new regime, environmental land management, we kind of need a bit of nature recovery on Dartmoor now. It's a national park. There's still 200 million for you, but we need a bit of nature recovery. And so what that means is no more sheep on the moor in winter, which, by the way, was the norm before 1970. They only started putting sheep on the moor since 1970 because the price of sheep is so low, they don't care if a few of them die of exposure. Now it suddenly makes sense to have sheep up on the moor, and that's catastrophic for nature. So we need no sheep on the moor, and we need a 70-80% reduction in sheep. But you can double your longhorn cattle, your native cattle, and you can double your horses. And Dartmoor was always really a place of horned cattle and horses, and even before humans, as Franz Vera will tell us. There's been an absolute shit show. They've gone bananas. The MPs of Dartmoor called a debate, Geoffrey Cox, all these other guys, and they produced this debate in Parliament in which the argument was not only should ministers now decide how to distribute the money, and Natural England should be strong on by ministers to keep subsidising sheep, forget nature recovery, even though it's Natural England, but also that Natural England should be declawed and defanged and basically dismantled. That was what they were saying in Parliament. And no opposition. Not the Lib Dems, not the Labour Party, nobody standing up for nature in that debate at all. It was all about appeasement. So this is the battle. If Dartmoor goes the wrong way, then the whole environmental land management scheme is called into question. But it says on the face of the bill, public money for public good. So it's technically illegal now for Natural England to hand out that money for no public good in return. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But sheep are a catastrophe on Dartmoor.
Yeah. Now, you have what implicitly you are implying, the wilding, and you mentioned that, and you are also yourself on your 500-acre farm in Somerset, you are rewilding. Although it may not be a very strong argument, but still lots of people think that food growing is very important, increasing population. If we leave land to trees and animals and all that, where will we have enough food for people?
Yeah.
So what is your response to such
those are
question?
the two main arguments against meaningful restoration of nature, are food and communities.
Yeah.
And at first look, those are very valid. Those are very valid considerations. Aside from the moral question of can we lecture the world on protecting and restoring nature when we have none ourselves, and the fact that we've just joined 196 countries in the world at Montreal in December and signed a pledge in which we have promised by 2030 to restore 30% of our land, 30% of our sea for nature. So that aside, the food argument, in my opinion, is a red herring. We are, as it happens, one of the more food-secure nations on Earth. We grow about 2/3 of what we consume in this country. And if you go back 200 years, in 1820, 1830, we used to import about 2/3 of the food we produce. And the roughly 1/3 that we import, they're often things that we can't grow here, avocados, bananas, things like that. If we're interested in food security, which we should be, let's look at the 50% of the food that we grow in this country that goes in the bin. It was 20% in 1970. Today, half. From farm to fork, half goes in the bin. And no one's looking seriously at how you reduce that. Often things go in the bin just because they're misshapen, they don't look quite right. And let's also look look, which no one does, at the 300,000 acres of our primest of prime arable land used to grow food for machines, and maize and so on. They turn it into bioenergy, they call it green fuel and so on. I mean, in a food insecure nation, you would grow crops for people. 92-ish% of India's arable crops is fed to human beings. In this country, it's about a third. A huge chunk goes to machines, and a huge chunk goes to animals. So we figured out that you can grow a crop over here, and then you can stuff animals into these grotesquely inhumane indoor facilities where you rob these animals of every last scrap of what it is to be alive. They don't see the sun until the day they go in a truck to the abattoir. You can go on all day about the cruelty of these indoor units. But there's also just the food security question. You're turning 20 calories of food that could be fit for people into 1 calorie of pork or chicken or whatever. So if we want to improve food security, we look at things like food waste, we look at how we use our primest land, we look at development, golf courses, those kinds of things on grade 1, grade 2 farmland, which we shouldn't really be building on. And we look at things like vertical farming and so on. There's one facility in Australia now producing 20% of all the tomatoes in Australia, using 0 pesticides, herbicides or fungicides, using about 1/1000th of the land, 1/100th of the water, and about 1/10 the energy. So there's very interesting things that can be done around salads and stuff, things that we would otherwise import from far away. 85% of the food we grow in this country comes from just 1/5 of the land. 85% just from 1/5, which is mostly in the east of England. If you look at the bottom 20% in terms of productivity, the official statistics say we produce about 1.5% of our food in our national parks, Dartmoor, Bodmin, Selwood, where I am. About 1% of our food-ish, 1.5, comes from 20% of the land. But when you take into account feed that has to be grown elsewhere and brought in the winter, and when you take into account the damage done to the hydrological system by sheep ranching and so on, which negatively impacts productivity elsewhere, they're really net negative, these landscapes, at the moment in terms of food production. It's a complete red herring, the idea that if we reduce productivity in these landscapes, it's going to have any bearing whatsoever on our food security. It's really not true at all. In fact, the greatest threat to our food security is not having healthy nature, pollinators, clean water, soil, and so on. So I think it's used by the anti-brigade really to kind of bash rewilding on the head and to terrify people that, if we rewild our national parks, we're going to starve. Or those that don't starve are going to be eaten by, I think I said beavers earlier on. But the important thing about the Franz Vera thesis, it means we don't have to end farming in our remoter landscapes. That's the beauty of it, because the second argument against rewilding is about communities, and people, they're right when they say that farming communities in places like Dartmoor, they're the backbone and they're the soul of our country. That in Wales, it's the farming communities in the valleys are the last repositories of Welsh-speaking people. So no one is suggesting an end to farming, because Franz Vera points out we need the cattle. We just need these people to reduce their number of sheep dramatically, and it's only recently, in the last 150 years, that sheep have exploded. Now, there were a few 100,000, maybe 1 million at most in the early Victorian era. Now there's nearly 40 million. The proposition is, reduce the sheep or get rid of them, and go back to farming in a gentler, more traditional way, using horned cattle, and we'll make you high-speed broadband so you can do other things on the side, and you can sell natural capital. You'll get payments for helping to reduce flooding and sequestering carbon and delivering biodiversity recovery and providing open access for walkers and the public. And also you'll be selling a little bit of food still. You'll have your box scheme and your wilder beef or whatever you want to call it. And there's a whole potential flourishing of the economy and society of our remoter landscapes in a wilder landscape. Look at the Cantabrian mountains of Spain or the Apennine mountains of Italy. They're flourishing in this way. So I think we can have it all, kind of thing. I think it's a silver bullet. We can have a little bit of farming, with active farming communities, loads of nature, loads of carbon in our national parks. I think there is a sort of silver bullet.
Right. Before I open for questions from the audience, I would like, because you in your book, you talked a lot about spiritual fulfillment and nourishment coming from nature, and how you found solace and recovery and healing through nature. So what is the spiritual dimension and the love dimension of nature? When you talked about economics, you talked about practicalities, but could you talk a little bit about your spiritual relationship with nature?
So growing up, and by growing up I mean the first 40 years, I had a deep love of nature, but I would not have attributed it to any kind of spirituality. I found a deep fascination in love for the natural world, and I wanted to immerse myself in rewilding in any way that I could. And was definitely not interested in religion or spirituality. I wouldn't have used the term God, for example.
Now your book title, first word is God.
Yes, we'll come to that. So I didn't go to church. I'm christened and confirmed, but only because each time they gave me a week of school kind of thing. I almost thought that an invisible God, invisible spirits, and all that was sort of a distraction. I maybe even considered religion to be somewhat complicit in the destruction of nature, because they somehow created a license for us to be very good Christians or Jews or Muslims, whilst trashing the larder of life and taking exactly what we want, because they sort of took God out of nature, certainly in some interpretation. So I didn't really think about any of these things. And then the unthinkable happened, and I remember very early on, like days after, I went to swim in the pond, which I do a lot, and it was a sunny July evening, and I went there because it just felt good to swim in water. Thinking about it, it just felt good. And I remember coming up to the surface, and the sun was sort of shining low, late evening, and it just, sometimes the world looks so beautiful you can't quite absorb what you're part of, and the dragonflies and the humming of life everywhere. And I was astonished that I still found this beautiful, and that it still made me feel good, even though everything was blackness in my mind. And I think that was the beginning of a moment where I realised that really nature sort of held me in some way, and that maybe there's more, maybe we just see the tip of the iceberg. And that's really what my book is about, is a year of magical thinking. And I don't come to the end of the book with any kind of anything, I don't know any more than I knew at the start of the book, except that I'm extremely open-minded to the idea that what we see is not all we get. And that nature.
So what do you say that the kind of sense of the sacred with nature?
Yeah, and I think now I recognise that I always did. I just wouldn't have known how to articulate it. My brother-in-law is a devout Muslim, and he used to say to me that nature is it's the primordial manifestation of God, Ben. And he used to say, look, just stop talking for a second and just smell these flowers. Thank the Lord for fragrance. And he used to, for him, nature was the way to feel close to the divine. And I might have dismissed some of the more spiritual elements of what he was saying, and now I don't. I think that we're part of a grand mystery that is far beyond our ability to understand.
So by calling God is an octopus, you are saying God is nature, or nature is God.
You asked me this earlier, and I wished you hadn't. But now again, I guess now that I'm sort of there's no getting out of it. It's going to come out, and at the end of a year of learning how to live with something that I didn't think it was possible to survive, and a year of searching for some ongoing trace of my daughter, and a year of magical thinking, which might have been the title of the book had Joan Didion not already done it, I decided, with a great amount of trepidation, to shut myself away with 4 others and 4 supervisors and a guide, and drink a psychedelic brew called ayahuasca. I honestly took a great deal of courage, because this was something that wasn't really my life. I was not really kind of tripping at festivals and things. I hadn't really done that, growing up. And also, you were quite vulnerable in that state. A year after, and I was definitely emotionally quite vulnerable. But some people I really respect, separately had come to me and had a quiet word, or written me a letter saying, I think we should do this. And I came to the idea that if I'm going to see where Iris has gone, this might be the way. So it was sort of as crude as that. Is there another room that I can kind of sneak through a secret door and have a peek? That's kind of the thinking. And so I got, mega high on this stuff. This is, it's no joke. It was terrible. The second night was much more frightening than the first, because I knew what was going to happen to me. It's like going into some completely different, alternate, lucid dream state in which you don't really have any control. And I've described in the book, so I won't try to describe here what happened.
The last chapter of the book is about...
Yeah, suffice to say that it was deeply meaningful, maybe the most meaningful and profound and beautiful experience of my life. I don't know that I'll ever do it again. I don't know that I need to ever do it again. It feels like a very odd, like a trip to Japan, something you plan meticulously and do once or twice in your life and enjoy it greatly. But I don't know why, but I long to do it. So I, as you emerge from it, mostly you're consumed by a feeling of relief that you're alive. And I asked one of the nice people who was supervising me if there was any chance of a pen and paper. And I kind of shakily wrote what I thought were my sort of profound kind of thoughts at that moment, and it was all largely illegible. But when I tidied up my stuff at the end of the 2 days, there was a piece of paper I found it, and I'd written in big letters, the only thing that was legible, God is an octopus. So that's what I called the book. And then Bloomsbury then said, oh, we love it. Because I said maybe a book with the word God in the title is a bit like a book with the word war in the title. You might want to pick it up. But they said the opposite is true. So that's why it's called. And also suffice to say, I had a text message from the Daily Mail about half an hour ago saying, oh, we heard you took ayahuasca like Prince Harry, and your book's coming out next week, and my blood ran cold, and I haven't thought how to reply to it. I guess I'm a bit stuck with it now, so...
Certainly, you have done a brave thing, a courageous thing to come out with all that honest experiences of your daughter's death and ending with ayahuasca and love of nature. All that is absolutely fascinating story in the book, and I hope people will enjoy reading it. But I would like to open this session for questions because we are nearly 9 o'clock. So is there a microphone somewhere? Yes, there's a microphone. If anybody would like to ask any question to Ben about all his love of nature and practicalities and even economy of nature, and putting, here's the question there. Can you bring microphone here?
Hi, thank you. That was so wonderful. But I have a question about the economic side that you raised. I'd like to know how you think that putting the price on nature is going to make the difference, because my sense of, once we started with the cap and trading of carbon and all of that, and putting a price tag on nature has allowed for it to be sold off. It actually has enabled the sale of it in many cases rather than protecting it. So I'm curious if you could say a bit more about why you seemed very convinced by that, and I think there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. So if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
So the Wessex Water Company, about 10 years ago, were faced with the prospect of having to spend about £900 million on a water treatment plant near Poole in Dorset. And some bright sparks within Wessex Water suggested to their bosses that instead of spending £900 million on a water treatment plant, they spent a handful of £1 million a year subsidising farmers through the catchment to reduce the nitrates that was leaching from their land. And so the Poole Harbour nutrient neutrality market was born, in which about 250 farmers agreed to do a little bit of rewilding, much better management of their slurry. A lot of them went organic, and they did a whole different mix of things on their land with no relationship to government. This was purely a relationship between those farmers and the water company. And the deal has lasted, and it's really been a huge success, such that now the council of Poole have said, well, actually, we're noticing a reduction in flooding. We want this to go a bit further to help reduce flooding as well. So now the payments those farmers in that catchment are receiving are payments for nutrient neutrality and payments for flood reduction. And the Wessex Water Company then spun that team out, and they've set up this thing called N-Trade, and they're setting up markets up and down the country, which are called nutrient neutrality markets. And the governments have very little to do with it, and the payments are typically more generous than the payments that the government was handing out in subsidies. So it was meaningful for these farmers. So in my part of Selwood, Sallow, was a great willow forest once, willow and oak, between Bath and Frome and Wincanton, and there were moves to start to restore that wood pasture. My neighbour Fred Nichols has done his back in He's in his 70s, his daughter doesn't really want to farm, she's got some holiday lets. They've had dairy cattle, he just can't do it anymore. But he wants to keep the farm, it's been in his family for many generations. And the nutrient neutrality payment that he's getting from the water company through N-Trade, which is a new market, it's their second market, makes the difference between him staying on the land and him leaving the land. He's got a few longhorns, just like I do. He's doing effectively Franz Vera-style rewilding, although he'd call it, extensive beef or whatever. But the difference has been the nutrient neutrality. And so there is a danger, I recognise, there's a danger in people being cleared from the land for a new kind of clearances. But I think that's more of a problem of the way our land market works than a problem of payments for environmental services. The biggest factor in clearing people from the land today is commercial timber. Now, there's huge funds like Gresham House, which is a London-listed fund with billions under management. They've managed to accumulate, I think, 350,000 hectares of land in Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and England. And what they do is just blanket it with monocultures of artless blocks of kind of pines or conifers, which they then cut to make pulp for Amazon boxes or whatever. And I think that there's an inherent issue around land ownership and how we help people stay in the land. But I think done correctly, these markets are a good way to keep people in the land rather than the opposite. And I don't have all the answers. I just know that if you're Fred Nichols, who's not making any money from his dairy, he'll make even less money from extensive beef, which is all he can manage. You know, the nutrient neutrality market's what keeps him in business. And he's doing something genuinely useful. He's helping to deliver drinking water to the people of Bristol and Bath, and he's helping to protect the people of Frome from flooding, just by having more nature on his land. And he's one of about 40 now who signed up to that. So I think we need to encourage it, but within a framework that carefully protects communities from the kind of ravages of the market. And it must be possible to work that out.
So what you are saying is that you can have both. You can have a sense of the sacred and love of nature, but also you can make it economically viable.
Yeah, I think it has to be.
Both.
I think you have to make it viable, otherwise the alternative is to rip it out and have sheep or whatever. I mean, if you removed all subsidies from Dartmoor, so there are no subsidies now, and no markets of any kind, then the only response would be to triple sheep numbers and just do it as intensively as you can to try and farm your way out of the problem. That's what farmers would do. So you have to provide an economic incentive so they can get on. The term you used earlier was a right livelihood. We need to protect right livelihoods in our remoter landscapes. A lot of these issues are not so much an issue in our productive landscapes. You know, the new environmental land management scheme will have a totally different outcome in our productive farm landscapes where we grow a lot of food. That will be about rewarding probably commercial farmers, but they're pretty large farmers in East Anglia. They're typically 3,000 or 4,000 acres with big machinery and so on. They will be rewarded for blending the best of ancient wisdom, things like rotational practices and not tilling the ground, with the best of modern technology, things like drones and soil sensors that allow you to use chemicals much more sparingly. You know, all those things that fall under the umbrella of regenerative farming. Now, I think there'll be a big change, but it's already a corporate landscape in those places. It just is.
Thank you. Any next question? Any other? There's a question there.
Hi, thank you. That's really amazing. You've probably seen that in Bristol that the zoo is closed and it's been repurposed. It's been approved by the council for redevelopment. And there's been huge protests about it. So my question is, how do you balance rewilding with the need for housing that we so desperately need?
So I think the two places rewilding is likely to happen are in the national parks, which are already protected from development, and generally there isn't a need for housing in the kind of middle of Dartmoor or up in the Pennines or the Lake District. So I think that's one place that rewilding will happen, in the way that I've described, kind of wild farming, if you like. And the other place where rewilding needs to happen is in the vicinity of where people live. And there is now a biodiversity net gain kind of requirement where anyone building anything has to create some kind of, in my opinion, poorly defined uplift in biodiversity, but it is possible. So I think you can do rewilding where people live. You know, building a housing. If we collectively in this room were responsible to come up with some design for a housing development, you can guarantee that we'd have a street running through the middle, and we'd have swift bricks, and the flat roofs would have meadows on them, and rubble roofs, and we'd have hedgehog boxes, and we'd do all kinds of things, and wildflower verges, and we'd weave nature into the built environment. I just chaired for a year the Rewilding London task force, and we just put out our recommendations, and Steve Khan's put £2 million so far with more to come into exactly that kind of stuff. But we also need functional ecosystems where people can actually access them and walk in them. And I think that's as essential as house building. I think we've got to make sure that there's space for nature in the greenbelt. And I think that boils down to, going back to this point about markets, if you're a farmer in the greenbelt, you can't be expected just to throw your farm open, because you have 4,000 people picnicking there every single day. I'm a believer in right to roam, but I do recognise the concerns of farmers in the vicinity of London, Manchester, right where the cities are. I think it's too much to ask them to do that without some kind of framework. So what you can say to farmers in the greenbelt is, create some habitat, do some rewilding, we'll have part of a nature recovery network where it connects with your neighbours, create some access and so on, and we'll pay you quite generously as taxpayers to do that, because it's in your interest and ours. As to the zoo, it's the same issue with pubs, by the way. They're all being closed down and turned into I mean, the market unchecked, we have a housing development in Hyde Park. I think that's what government exists for, isn't it? Is to tell the market what it can and can't do, and where not.
Good, thank you. Next question. There's a question there.
I am no expert, by the way. I've got really imposter syndrome answering these questions. I'm an enthusiast like all of you. I'm not an expert on anything of this.
Yes, and I said to Ben, we need more enthusiasts than experts, because experts have made a mess.
I know, although I didn't think you should say it's a bit Brexity that. Experts got us into this mess. Was a bit Brexity, wasn't it? Who was it that said that? Go.
Okay, yeah, that's just, there's one thing we haven't mentioned, which is like the wolf in the area, really, which is the NFU, I think. I mean, every time we try and do anything, the NFU come up, oh no, can't be having that. There was even a few months ago, NFU suggesting we should go back to headage payments, which would have totally destroyed areas like the Welsh Hills, Dartmoor, Exmoor. It would have been a disaster. I don't understand why the NFU are taking this position. There is across the country, there is this, desire for more nature recovery, and farmers can be a big part of that. There's no doubt about that at all. I think the NFU are just totally out of control on this, and but they have governments here, don't they? All the time. They just do whatever they are basically told. So I don't know how we get around that unless we have a change of government or whatever. And just one more point, you talked about sheep as well. Just a little story here, though. I do a lot of bird surveys at the National Trust on the coast in the South Hams, and we had a big discussion about pulling sheep off one area, just one area, because in the spring it was just grazed to death. It was literally like what you're sitting on. Took the sheep off, and then 2 days ago there were carpets, literally carpets of spring squirrel, thrift, sea campion. It can be done. It really can be done. All that's needed is a desire, and we just got to get there.
So agree.
Thank you.
So I was on the board of DEFRA for 5 years, and I can't tell you how much influence, how bad it is in terms of the influence that the National Farmers Union and also the multinational fishing corporations have over that department. DEFRA is a tiny department. It's like the rounding error in government. It's a tiny, weeny little department. And they've been kicked around and bullied, and they're terrified of these two monolithic special interests, farming and fishing. And what the face that they present to the public, these two industries, farming, it's the kind of happy housewife scattering corn for the chickens in the pretty farmyard, and fishing, it's kind of Captain Birdseye with yellow oilskins. And the reality is these are factory ships, mostly belonging to multinational corporations, and in farming, the National Farmers Union really speaks for the biggest farming interests. So it's weakening, but it's appalling. Thankfully, in farming, the nature-friendly farming network is growing very, very fast. They've got thousands of members, it's growing. They get invited now more often than the NFU in many cases to come and speak to government. And the National Farming Union is particularly desperate and angry because their grip is loosening. But as you say, just from a strategic point of view, imagine trying to defend payments to landowners based upon how much land they've got. And that's basically what the old scheme was. 50% of the money went to the 10% richest farmers. You know, imagine that. Imagine giving Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum 1.8 million a year, you know, or whatever. How do you defend that? Whether you've got Jacob Rees-Mogg as treasurer, or John McDonnell, or anything in between, it's impossible to justify it. So that would have been cancelled. At some point, within a government or two, it would have been phased out. Treasury would have said, oh, we've got better things to spend the money on, whatever it might be. Whereas, under an environmental land management scheme, where you can, to go back to the point of valuing nature, where you can understand the value of where the money's going, these farmers here are delivering wood pastures on Dartmoor, as well as carbon sequestration and flood management, and therefore we're paying them for that. These farmers over here are giving public access to vibrant nature within a stone's throw of central London that is worth paying for. The environmental land management scheme is the best possible defence for the farming industry to hold on to its hosepipe of public money into the future. You'd have thought they'd be overjoyed that this thing had been implemented. So that they've been strategically idiotic, I think, as well as, I think borderline corrupt in the way that the decisions are taken. And when you look at who's taking the decisions on the other side, they're landowners. You look at who's in the EFRA committee, which MPs. Well, it's Mr. this landowner, Mr. that landowner MP, Mr. that landowner MP. In no other regulatory environment in the government do the representatives of the industry make the decisions on how the industry is regulated. If you have a chunk of land, you ought really not to be making decisions on government's regulation of landowning. So I think you're right. Thank God, you know, whether you, from whatever part of the political spectrum you come from, thank God for Michael Gove, because he came in and was like, I said, I have to endure another NFU whinge-a-thon, but I don't care, quote. And so he was the one that did this environmental land management scheme, and that's why they hate him. And he did a good thing, and when they look back on his political career, I think that this will be the only thing people remember, will be the environmental land management scheme, especially if it gets copied in America and in the European Union, or Australia and other places subsequently. On sheep, I just couldn't agree more. The sheep have got to go. The sheep are, the British public attachment to sheep is the biggest obstacle standing in the way of nature recovery, and they've got to go. The only place where we need sheep are in regenerative farming systems on good quality farmland, where you grow your wheat and then the sheep come and graze off the stubble. Or to look nice in a historic park, or as a hobby. We could do with 1 million sheep. And everyone says, well, what about wool? Well, wool is so important as an insulating material, as an alternative to fossil fuels. It's really a good product, wool. But there's so many sheep, the wool price has collapsed to nothing. You can't give it away. So the best way to support the wool industry is by getting rid of sheep, or lots of them. Silence of the lambs, they said in the Independent.
Thank you. We can take one more question. Okay, last question.
Sorry. You started talking about keystones.
Yeah.
So, how effective is rewilding without keystones? And have we the right systems, laws, incentives in place to ensure the introduction of the reintroduction or re-establishment of keystones quickly enough? And what more do we need to do, all of us, really, if not?
I mean, did you see, just today, the Minister, Trudy Harrison, who I'd never heard of, because I'm no longer a DEFRA, in the committee answering questions about species reintroductions? I mean, honestly, you cannot imagine the level of ignorance. No knowledge whatsoever, no interest. We'll look after what we've got. We don't need to mess around with bringing other species in. The government is really in a terribly weak place on this. There was a species reintroduction task force with £7.5 million worth of funding that was set up by Gove, and it never got implemented because one Secretary of State after the next, since then, has appeased the National Farmers Union by saying, don't worry, we're not going to do any species reintroductions. So the government's in a terrible place. The good news is, it's kind of happening anyway. So the cattle is a farming question. In Britain, it's principally a farming question. I personally think that we will see bison in the Highlands of Scotland, maybe in Wales. I think we'll have bison back. There are already some in Kent, you can go visit them. I think we will have bison back, but for the most part, that keystone is sorted because native cattle are our way of keeping farmers with a right livelihood in our national parks and so on. The beavers are coming back fast. There's way more than people think. There's 5,000 or 6,000 beavers now, people moving them around. I sort of moved to some degree in some of these landowning circles. I heard some old toff the other day in London saying to his friend, I want to put down a couple of pairs of beavers if you can trap them off for me. They're sort of moving around black market style. So beavers are back big time, and there's beaver bombing going on everywhere. So it doesn't matter what the government thinks, they're going to look like they're on the back foot, and they are.
walking that talk.
The wild boar has made a recovery. I mean, someone said it's been like trying to set fire to, wet logs. But finally, the fire is caught, and there's probably 5,000 boar now in the borders of Scotland and so on. And in regenerative farming systems, people are starting to use pigs. I was on a 4,000-acre regenerative farm in Norfolk. They grow potatoes, then they put pigs, then they grow wheat, then they put sheep, and pigs are making their way back now in more regenerative systems. So that leaves the wolf. And I think we'll get lynx back before we get wolves. And I don't think you can call the lynx a keystone because they wouldn't live in high enough densities. They only kill muntjac and roe deer. They're very secretive, but they're iconic. And once you get lynx back and the sky doesn't fall in, and there are lynx in the Highlands of Scotland and they start to spread and so on, and England and Kielder and so on, within 4 or 5 years of having lynx back, I think the question of wolves becomes somewhat unstoppable, and I think it will happen. But there are many in the rewilding movement that say we shouldn't even talk about wolves. But I think we have to talk about it, because why should we hide from what is the absolutely obvious, incontrovertible truth that our ecosystems are a shadow of what they could be without wolves? And from the perspective of rewilding ourselves and our society and learning to live in harmony with nature, the wolf, for me, is totemic. Until we can learn to live with the most difficult wildlife and figure out how to achieve coexistence, I don't think we'll ever achieve harmony with nature as a whole. So I think it's kind of almost the most important. And that's why we should never hold back. So what can we do about it? We just have to be noisier. People have to just tell everyone. We've got to be noisy on social media. We have to complain. Write letters to newspapers that write stupid articles. Write to our MPs. We have to demand it and be noisy. And more people are doing that. The more noise you make, the more it happens. And they're definitely hearing it. I was about to do a name drop there, but I was in number 10 Downing Street to meet the new, very junior environment advisor. She's lovely. And they are fully cognizant of the opportunity in nature, especially since wild isles. They know that Labour doesn't have a nature offering yet at all. The Tories are considered the party that filled the rivers with shit, which is not totally unfair. And both parties, it's wide open. So whichever party comes up with a really good offering on nature, really optimistic, species reintroductions, rewilding, and all that stuff, there's a lot of votes to be won on that. And that's what we need to tell people. We don't care what party you're from, we'll vote for the one that is radical in this stuff. That's how it's going to be.
Thank you, Ben, for your enthusiasm, for your passion, for your information, and your fluency is wonderful. And we have enjoyed your talk, and we wish every success, and we will all be with you, and we are all prepared to work for rewilding appropriately wherever it is necessary, and balance and live in harmony with nature. So thank you for your wonderful
Satish. Thank you so much.
presentation. Thank you.